Concubinage is an interpersonal relationship in which a person engages in an ongoing sexual relationship with another person to whom they are not or cannot be married to the full extent of the local meaning of marriage. The inability to marry may be due to multiple factors, such as differences in social rank status, an existent marriage, religious prohibitions, professional ones, or a lack of recognition by appropriate authorities. The woman in such a relationship is referred to as a concubine. The prevalence of concubinage and the status, rights and expectations of a concubine have varied between cultures, as have the rights of children of a concubine. Whatever the status and rights of the concubine, they were always inferior to those of the wife, and typically neither she nor her children had rights of inheritance. Historically, concubinage was frequently entered into voluntarily as it provided a measure of economic security for the woman involved. Involuntary or servile concubinage sometimes involved sexual slavery of one member of the relationship, usually the woman. Unlike ancient cultures, Christian Europe opposed concubinage, regarding any sexual relations outside of a monogamous marriage as sinful. Nevertheless, sexual relations outside marriage was not uncommon, especially among royalty and nobility, and the woman in such relationships was commonly described as a mistress. However, the children of such relationships were counted as illegitimate and were barred from inheriting the father's title or estates, even when there was an absence of any legitimate heirs. While various forms of long-term sexual relationships and cohabitation short of marriage have become increasingly common in the Western world, these are generally not described as concubinage. The terms concubinage and concubine are used today primarily when referring to non-marital partnerships of earlier eras. In modern usage, a non-marital domestic relationship is commonly referred to as cohabitation, and the woman in such a relationship is generally referred to as a girlfriend, lover or partner. Ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, the practice of keeping a slave concubine was little recorded but appears throughout Athenian history. The law prescribed that a man could kill another man caught attempting a relationship with his concubine for the production of free children, which suggests that her concubine's children were not granted citizenship. While references to the sexual exploitation of maidservants appear in literature, it was considered disgraceful for a man to keep such women under the same roof as his wife. Some interpretations of hetera have held they were concubines when they had a permanent relationship with a single man. Ancient Roman concubiny and concubiny. Concubinage was an institution practiced in ancient Rome that allowed a man to enter into an informal but recognized relationship with a woman who was not his wife, most often a woman whose lower social status was an obstacle to marriage. Concubinage was tolerated to the degree that it did not threaten the religious and legal integrity of the family. It was not considered derogatory to be called a concubina, as the title was often inscribed on tombstones. A concubiness was a young male slave sexually exploited by his master as a sexual partner. These relations, however, were expected to play a secondary role to marriage, within which institution an adult male demonstrated his masculine authority as head of the household. In one of his epithalamiums, Catullus assumes that the young bridegroom has a concubiness who considers himself elevated above the other slaves, but who will be set aside as his master turns his attention to marriage and family life. In the Bible, among the Israelites, men commonly acknowledged their concubines, and such women enjoyed the same rights in the house as legitimate wives. The concubine may not have commanded the same respect and inviolability as the wife. In the Levitical rules on sexual relations, the Hebrew word that is commonly translated as wife is distinct from the Hebrew word that means concubine. However, on at least one other occasion the term is used to refer to a woman who is not a wife, specifically, the handmaiden of Jacob's wife. In the Levitical code, sexual intercourse between a man and a wife of a different man was forbidden and punishable by death for both persons involved. Since it was regarded as the highest blessing to have many children, wives often gave their maids to their husbands if they were barren, as in the cases of Sarah and Hagar, and Rachel and Bilhah. The children of the concubine often had equal rights with those of the wife. For example, King Abimelech was the son of Gideon and his concubine. Later biblical figures such as Gideon and Solomon had concubines in addition to many childbearing wives. For example, the books of Kings say that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The account of the unnamed Levitor shows that the taking of concubines was not the exclusive preserve of kings or patriarchs in Israel during the time of the Judges, and that the rape of a concubine was completely unacceptable to the Israelite nation and led to a civil war. In the story, the Levitor appears to be an ordinary member of the tribe dedicated to the worship of God, who was undoubtedly dishonored both by the unfaithfulness of his concubine and her abandonment of him. However, after 4 months, he decides to follow her back to her family home to persuade her to return to him. Her father seeks to delay his return and he does not leave early enough to make the return journey in a single day. The hospitality he is offered at Gibeah, the way in which his host's daughter is offered to the townsmen, and the circumstances of his concubine's death at their hands describe a lawless time, where visitors are both welcomed and threatened in equal measure. The most disturbing aspect of this account is that both the Levitor and his host seek to protect themselves by offering their womenfolk to their aggressors for sex, in exchange for their own safety. The Levitor acts in a way that indicates that he believes that the multiple rape of his unfaithful concubine is preferable to the violation of the virginity of his host's daughter or a sexual assault on his own person. In the morning, the Levitor appears to be quite indifferent to the condition of his concubine and expects her to resume the journey, but she is dead. He dismembers her body and distributes her throughout the nation of Israel as a terrible message. This outrages and revolts the Israelite tribesmen, who then wreak total retribution on the men of Gibeah and the surrounding tribe of Benjamin when they support them, killing them without mercy and burning all their towns. The inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead are then slaughtered as a punishment for not joining the 11 tribes in their war against the Benjamites, and their 400 unmarried daughters given in forced marriage to the 600 Benjamite survivors. Finally, the 200 Benjamite survivors who still have no wives are granted a mass marriage by abduction by the other tribes. There are no concubines in the New Testament. Paul, the Apostle, emphasizes that church leaders should be in monogamous marriages, that believers should not have sexual relationships outside marriage, and that unmarried believers should be celibate. Marriage is to reflect the exclusive relationship between the husband and wife, described as a mystery. In Judaism, concubines are referred to by the Hebrew term pilegesh. The term is a loan word from ancient Greek pi alpha lambda lambda alpha kappa iota sigma, meaning a mistress staying in house. According to the Babylonian Talmud, the difference between a concubine and a full wife was that the latter received a ketubah and her marriage was preceded by an erusa. Neither was the case for a concubine. One opinion in the Jerusalem Talmud argues that the concubine should also receive a marriage contract, but without a clause specifying a divorce settlement. Certain Jewish thinkers, such as Maimonides, believed that concubines were strictly reserved for kings, and thus that a commoner may not have a concubine. Indeed, such thinkers argued that commoners may not engage in any type of sexual relations outside of a marriage. Maimonides was not the first Jewish thinker to criticize concubinage. For example, Leviticus Rabbah severely condemns the custom. Other Jewish thinkers, such as Nachmanides, Samuel ben Uri Shraga Phoebus, and Jacob Emden, strongly objected to the idea that concubines should be forbidden. In the Hebrew of the contemporary state of Israel, pilegesh is often used as the equivalent of the English word mistress, i.e., the female partner in extramarital relations, regardless of legal recognition. Attempts have been initiated to popularize pilegesh as a form of premarital, non-marital or extramarital relationship, is permitted by Jewish law. In China, successful men often had concubines until the practice was outlawed after the Communist Party of China came to power in 1949. The standard Chinese term translated as concubine was qie, a term used since ancient times. Concubines resembled wives in that they were recognized sexual partners of a male family member, expected to bear children from him. In English, the term concubine is also used for what the Chinese refer to as pinfei, consorts of emperors, some of very high rank. In pre-modern China, it was illegal and socially disreputable for a man to have more than one wife at a time, but he could have concubines. At first a man could have as many concubines as he could afford. However, from the Eastern Han onward, the maximal number of concubines a man could have was limited by law. The higher ranking and the more noble an identity a man possessed, the more concubines he was permitted to have. A concubine's treatment and situation were highly variable and were influenced by the social status of the male to whom she was engaged, as well as the attitude of the wife. In the Book of Rights chapter on the pattern of the family, it says, if there were betrothal rights, she became a wife, and if she went without these, a concubine. Besides, wives were married with dowries but concubines were not. Concubines could be taken without any of the ceremonies used in marriages, and neither remarriage nor a return to her natal home in widowhood were allowed. The position of the concubine was generally inferior to that of the wife. Although a concubine could produce heirs, her children would be inferior in social status to legitimate children, and the child of a concubine had to show filial duty to two women, the biological mother and legal mother, the wife of their father. Allegedly, concubines were occasionally buried alive with their masters to keep them company in the afterlife. After the death of a concubine, her sons would make an offering to her, but these offerings were not continued by her grandsons, who only made offerings to their grandfather's wife. Until the Song dynasty, it was treated as a serious breach of social ethics to promote a concubine to a wife. In Qing China, the status of concubines improved. It became permissible to promote a concubine to wife, if the wife had died and the concubine was the mother of the only surviving sons. Moreover, the prohibition against forcing a widow to remarry was extended to widowed concubines. Tablets for concubine mothers seem to have been more commonly placed in family ancestral altars and genealogies of some lineages listed. Concubine mothers. Despite the limitations imposed on Chinese concubines, history and literature offer examples of concubines who achieved great power and influence. For example, in one of the four great classical novels, Dream of the Red Chamber, 3 generations of the Jia family are supported by one favorite concubine of the emperor. Imperial concubines, kept by emperors in the Forbidden City, had different ranks and were traditionally guarded by eunuchs to ensure that they could not be impregnated by anyone but the emperor. In Ming China, there was an official system to select concubines for the emperor. The age of the candidates ranged mainly from 14 to 16. Virtues, behavior, character, appearance and body condition would all be taken as selection criteria. Lady Yanara, otherwise known as Empress Dowager Cixi, was arguably one of the most successful concubines in China's history. Cixi first entered the court as a concubine to the Zhanfeng emperor, and gave birth to his only surviving son, who would become the Tongzhi emperor. She would eventually become the de facto ruler of Qing China for 47 years after her husband's death. The concept of men having relationships with one or more concubines has seen a comeback since modern China has prospered. The women involved typically say they feel fine about exploiting their youth and beauty for the sake of earning money, not having to live with the primary wives anymore as in the past. In Islam, concubines were common in pre-Islamic Arabia, and when Islam arrived, it had a society with concubines. Islam introduced legal restrictions to the concubinage and encouraged manumission. According to the Islamic tradition, numerous hadiths show Muhammad and the early companions had concubines of their own, some of whom were willingly acquired in war. Children of concubines were generally declared as legitimate as children born in wedlock, and the mother of a free child was considered free upon the death of the male partner. In ancient times, two sources for concubines were permitted under an Islamic regime. Primarily, non-Muslim women taken as prisoners of war were made concubines, as happened after the Battle of the Trench, or in numerous later caliphates. Upon rejecting their initial faith and embracing Islam, it was encouraged to manumit slave women or bring them into formal marriage. Modern times. According to the rules of Islamic fiqh, what is halal by Allah in the Quran cannot be altered by any authority or individual. Therefore, although the concept of concubinage is halal, concubines are mostly no longer available in this modern era nor allowed to be sold or purchased in accordance with the latest human rights standards. However, as change of existing Islamic law is impossible, a concubine in this modern era, if existing, must be given all the due rights that Islam had preserved in the past. It is further clarified that all domestic and organizational female employees are not concubines in this era, and hence sex is forbidden with them, unless nikah or mut'ah is committed through the proper channels. Although sometimes the two are confused, mut'ah is not concubinage. In the United States, when slavery became institutionalized in the North American colonies, white men, whether or not they were married, sometimes took enslaved women as concubines, most often against the will of the woman. Marriage between the races was prohibited by law in the colonies and the later United States. Many colonies and states also had laws against miscegenation, or any interracial relations. From 1662 the colony of Virginia, followed by others, incorporated into law the principle that children took their mother's status, i.e., the principle of partus sequitur ventrem. All children born to enslaved mothers were born into slavery, regardless of their father's status or ancestry. This led to generations of multiracial slaves, some of whom were otherwise considered legally white before the American Civil War. In some cases, men had long-term relationships with enslaved women, giving them and their mixed-race children freedom and providing their children with apprenticeships, education and transfer of capital. In other cases, the men did nothing for the women except in a minor way. Such arrangements were more prevalent in the southern states during the antebellum years. Jefferson-Hemings controversy. Historians widely believe that the widower Thomas Jefferson, both before and during his presidency of the United States in the early 19th century, had an intimate relationship of 38 years with his multiracial slave, Sally Hemings, and fathered all of her 6 children of record. He freed all 4 of her surviving children as they came of age. The Hemingses were the only slave family to go free from Monticello. The children were 7/8 European in ancestry and legally white. 3 entered the white community as adults. A 1998 DNA study showed a match between the Jefferson male line and a male descendant of Sally Hemings. Blocage in Louisiana and former French territories, a formalized system of concubinage called blocage developed. European men took enslaved or free women of color as mistresses after making arrangements to give them a dowry, house or other transfer of property, and sometimes, if they were enslaved, offering freedom and education for their children. A third class of free people of color developed, especially in New Orleans. Many became educated, artisans and property owners, French-speaking and practicing Catholicism. These women combined French and African American culture and created an elite between those of European descent and the slaves. Today, descendants of the free people of color are generally called Louisiana Creole people.